Today we're going to talk about some practical points for the technique of gamut masking. So it can be tempting to think of the three corners of the gamut mask as primaries and imagine that you could mix the entire color space from there. However, there are some serious limitations to that approach. So let's try it out. Starting from these primaries, we'll begin by mixing up a purple. As we mix our red and our kind of blue-violet color, what we're going to find is that the resulting purple that we can make loses a lot of intensity in the mixture, in part because any mixture is going to be lower intensity than its constituent parts. On the other hand, some things about these primaries will actually take us out of the color space. So if we mix our yellow and our blue, in theory, according to the gamut mask, we would get a neutral gray. In reality, of course, we make a pretty strong green that is entirely outside our color space and would cause problems if we incorporate it into our painting. So we can't simply follow the primaries there either and stay inside. So in this last example, I'm going to mix our yellow with our red. And when we put those together, they actually will give us a pretty good medium intensity orange as shown on our gamut mask. So in some cases, treating the corners like primaries does actually work and correspond to nature. But very often they're either going to fail to create the full volume of color space, or you're going to find you get colors that are outside of your color space. So here's a really dramatic problem that can happen when you have a color space that sets the corners to non-primary colors. So in this case, we've got an orange, we've got a violet, and we've got a green as the outside boundaries of our color space. And if we tried to use those as primaries, something happens that's pretty troubling, and that is that our intensity just collapses. So rather than using those as primaries to get something that's going to happen along that midpoint, what happens instead is you get a very, very low intensity result. And so most of the color space that's in that triangle can't be made if you're using the corners as your starting points for those mixtures. So you've got to find other ways. And this is to clarify, there's nothing wrong with this color space. These are perfectly good colors, and this is a perfectly reasonable gamut mask to make. But what I'm illustrating here is just that simply assuming that the corners of the gamut mask are going to function as primaries isn't really going to work for you. And so this last example here so dramatically illustrates that collapse. Purple and green are making pretty much just an icy gray, and we don't get any of those blues that we thought we wanted when we set this up. So let's find our subjective neutral. The simplest way to do this is you've got these corners. To find the midpoint of each leg of your triangle, halfway between each corner. And you can get away with estimating these. And then you want to make an imaginary line from the midpoint of one leg all the way to the opposite corner. So like that. From here to here. And from this midpoint to that opposite corner. And you should find that all three of them will converge on a single point. What I'm demonstrating here is using your subjective neutral in a variety of different values. So our subjective neutral here is a low intensity yellow-green. And our gamut mask only shows it in one value. obviously your painting is going to need neutrals that are light values and neutrals that are dark values. And you'll need to be able to make sure that whether it's a very, very pale color or a very, very dark color, anytime your colors lose intensity, that they take on the characteristics of this subjective neutral. When desaturating colors on a gamut mask, we're always thinking of the relationship between the color and the subjective neutral. So you'll find that the rules kind of change. And so if we're starting from this red at the outside corner of our gamut mask, one of the easiest ways to desaturate it here is to simply add some of our subjective neutral to it. And remember, that's a low intensity yellow-green. So as our as our red desaturates, it's not going to desaturate toward a perfect neutral like it would in a normal color space, but rather it's going to show the influence of the subjective neutral. And so that red is going to get slightly more or less of that subtle yellow-green in it. And so here I'm just going to mix a string of colors from full saturation red on this gamut mask, lower and lower and lower until I basically get back to our subjective neutral. Here's a technique for assigning or finding various hues with a gamut mask where you know that your corners aren't going to function as primaries. And so in this example, you can see our corners are a yellow, green, an orange, and a violet, and those would have a massive collapsing problem if we tried to just use those as primaries and mix from there. So in order to kind of figure out how things are going to play out, we need to use another method. So here's how the formula works for this one. You start from your subjective primary, and that's that spot that's marked in the middle there, and you draw an imaginary line between your subjective primary and the location of the hue if we had the full gamut. And so on the left wheel you can see our attempt to find red. We go from the subjective primary all the way out to the edge of the triangle, and where that line intersects with the edge of the triangle, that is the most saturated red that this gamut can produce. On the right side, you can see us going from the same subjective neutral and reaching towards cyan. And what happens there is we actually reach the edge of the triangle at an almost dead green. So an extremely low intensity green is going to have to be our stand-in for cyan if this is our gamut mask. So using this technique and this formula, we can keep following its logic. And so on the right, you can see cyan is still played by a low intensity green. Then the question becomes, on this gamut mask, how do we talk about green? Or how do we talk about yellow-green? And that's illustrated over on the left. So if you can see the subjective neutral, and then we run out toward the green location, and we get a medium intensity yellow-green. So our green is going to be a medium intensity yellow-green. Whereas if something is yellow-green, we can express that with that higher line there that indicates a high intensity yellow-green. So in this case, you'd actually be shifting your hues over a good deal. Yellow-green would be able to play it pretty straight at full intensity, but as yellow-green diminishes intensity, it's actually the way we talk about green. And when we use green at very low intensity, it's actually our stand-in for cyan. And once we get to our blues, we have to just kill our color entirely to gray. And so you can think of a continuum between gray being cyan or blue, and yellow-green being able to be used at full intensity. And then you can manage those hues as a kind of band in between. So now the bad news. This particular formula or technique is not a sure shot. It would be great if we could just apply this really consistently and mechanically across the board, but that will not work. You will need to change your approach depending on what's in your still life and how your gamut mask reacts to what you're looking at. And that's what we're going to illustrate next. So here's an image of this gamut mask with that technique strictly applied from all directions. So starting from the subjective neutral, we work out in the direction of the hue, and wherever that line intersects with the edges of our color space, that's the maximum intensity of that hue. I'm going to show you guys this same gamut mask where we move some of those hues around as needed. So when we look at this image, one of the main things to watch out for is that this gamut mask is very bad at blue, and this still life needs a lot of blue from us. So starting from there, we can see that if we don't need our violet, what we can do is we can basically shift blue down into the violet position and let violet play the role of blue. And we scoot that hue over a little bit, but we get a bunch of intensity in return. And so if you don't need that purple, sometimes you can get purple to play the role of a very intense blue and solve that blue problem for yourself. Now, if you didn't make that adjustment, what would happen is you'd essentially only use the top 2/3 of this gamut mask, and your painting would have really, really low intensity in all of your cool hues. So reassigning hues to pick up intensity is a really important step here. Now in this still life, we've added a yellow element, but our blue shift still remains useful to us. The adding of the yellow doesn't really cause any problems with our orange or with our yellow green. We can pretty much play it straight and use those same choices we made last time.
Stay with me here.
In this situation, what I'm going to need is a really intense green and a strong yellow green. And so the move I've made here is I've pushed my green position way up into a very intense yellow green. So the shadow of that cube where it's true green, I'm going to use an intense yellow green to play that role. And then I've allowed myself to let the pear scoot a little bit toward yellow. So things that would be yellow green are now going to be exaggerated in the yellow direction a little bit, so I can get that intensity between yellow and yellow green. So in this still life, we've brought purple back into the mix, which means our cyan has to slide back up toward gray, our blue moves back up toward gray, and our blue violet is once again a very low intensity purple. That purple object we could actually get to using a high intensity violet. We can also probably get away with painting that with something a little more red violet or magenta to help protect the difference between what looks like purple and what looks like blue in that still life. Because remember, relationships are key here. In this version of the still life, the main problem I'm going to face is that wide variety of yellow greens that are going on here. I've got a couple hues of yellow green in several different intensities. So what I've done is I've set my yellow-green pair over as close to yellow as I can, my blue-violet column there as close to violet as I can, so I can spread everything out that's between blue-violet and yellow-green, so I can get as much range of hue to differentiate all of those different objects that are so important that run between blue and yellow in this particular still life. So now a change here you see is we've eliminated all of the blue objects of all the different hues between cyan, blue, blue, violet, and we've just got still a wide variety of yellows, yellow greens, and our purple. So you can see that the blue hues are basically all just collapsed toward gray, in part because we don't need them. So we can safely take advantage of all the purple space we have, take advantage of all the yellow, green, and yellow to talk about the subtle differences between these objects.
So remember, there's no easy formula or recipe for applying this technique. It's going to include a lot of judgment calls from you, the artist. While you're working, depending on the setup and depending on your gamut mask, you're going to have to react to the situation differently, managing hue and intensity very carefully. Good luck.